Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore what I'm calling the existential art of waiting. And here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video. As usual, you can also find it in the description of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, part of the reason I want to explore waiting is that I sense that it's become something of a lost art in our world. Well, at least in the culture of the United States, where I live. Probably a lot of that has to do with the fact that in the 21st century, when we experience having to wait for something, most of us just whip out our smartphones to distract ourselves instead. The reason we do that is pretty straightforward. Most of us just don't like to wait. For most of us, it's just an unpleasant impediment to getting what we want, rather than an experience that might have value in its own right. And of course, the larger overarching reality of the 21st century is that a lot of our world is tailored to our desire for immediate gratification. So, in essence, waiting has become difficult for us because it involves deferring immediate gratification to some point in the future, rather than being able to enjoy whatever we want right now. However, waiting is, and always has been, one of life's great inevitabilities, probably right up there with death and taxes. The obvious fact is that sometimes we get what we want right when we want it, but a lot of the time we don't. And so we find ourselves waiting for red lights, and then a little while later, waiting in traffic jams. And then, when we finally get to the grocery store, we have to wait in line for the cashier. And then, a little later that afternoon, we have to wait at the doctor's office, or maybe at the airport. And while we're doing that, we're also waiting for our tax refund, which we hope will come pretty soon, because we've been waiting for a long time to buy a new smartphone. I think you get the picture. Basically, even though our world tries its best to cater to our desire for immediate gratification, waiting is still a fundamental part of pretty much everyone's life, and rarely does a day go by when we don't have to wait for something. And so, in light of the inevitability and commonality of waiting, the question is, what can we do, if anything, to turn that experience into something that actually deepens and enhances our lives, rather than just an everyday nuisance and waste of time? Or, to put it in other words, what can we possibly gain from the experience of not getting what we want in the present moment and having to wait for it? In my view, there are two interrelated areas of life where learning the art of waiting has fairly immediate and powerful impact. The first has to do with our existential freedom, that is, with the process of liberating ourselves from various forms of enslavement. And the second has to do with our ability to live through, and even profit from, the painful times in our lives, and especially those when we can't easily escape into some form of distraction. Let's look at the issue of freedom first. And let me just start with a question. Have you ever noticed how few genuinely free spirits there actually are in this world? It's really pretty shocking when you take the time to notice it. And I suspect that that's because practically all of us live in one form of imprisonment or another. As I've mentioned in recent videos, part of that has to do with the fact that most of us just tend to follow the anonymous crowd's arbitrary standards, values, and habits, even when we know deep down inside that they don't really fit us. That is, most of us are pretty thoroughly enslaved by the idea that we have to live our lives inauthentically most of the time. However, another form of imprisonment that's at least as common and powerful has to do with how we're enslaved to our desires. That's true, first because a lot of the time they aren't even authentically our own in the first place, but are merely what we've been told we should want in life. But it's also true of our desires in a more general way. To put it in the words of the great 21st century sage, Tyler Durden, the things you own end up owning you. Of course, that doesn't stop us from wanting them, nor from confusing freedom with getting what we want in life. And the experience of waiting is important because it can help us realize how that's happening in our lives. An example, let's say that you're waiting in line to buy a new pair of shoes, and because the line is long and slow, you're getting more and more impatient and irritated by it. You'd really rather be home enjoying a nice hot supper, but there you are stuck in line. And maybe after half an hour or so, your thinking starts to run something like this. Gee, how much do I really need those shoes? Enough to keep enduring the lousy mood I'm experiencing right now? And why the hell am I even buying them in the first place? Don't I already have 4 pairs of shoes at home? Who am I trying to impress? Myself? Someone else? Maybe I should just put this pair of shoes back on the shelf and leave. And maybe you do exactly that. In other words, the experience of waiting has value because our annoyance with it can push us toward recognizing the reality of our addictive attachments and dependencies. The way we're burdened by and enslaved to our desires for X, Y, and Z. And at the same time, we can then start to lay claim to a deeper meaning for our freedom than usual. The experience of waiting is basically life's way of trying to tell us that the real meaning of human freedom isn't about trying to get what we want, which only leads to a life of ever-increasing thraldom, but about bringing our desires into alignment with the world's reality. However, the experience of waiting also invites us to lay claim to our existential freedom in an even deeper and more powerful way, basically at the level of our subjective experience itself. Okay. This time, let's say you're stuck in a traffic jam, so you can't just exercise your freedom by leaving. At least, not without a whole lot of legal repercussions. And once again, you're starting to get antsy and impatient. Have you ever wondered about what's really going on in that kind of experience? After all, when you look at it objectively, well, you're probably sitting there in a very comfortable, well-padded, ergonomically designed seat, probably listening to some of the world's finest musicians playing some of your favorite music, in a completely climate-controlled environment. If it gets 1/2 degree too warm or too cold for you, all you have to do is flick your wrist and you're instantly back to a state of complete thermal bliss. And when you look out your windshield, well, there's almost always something wonderful to see. The beautiful trees by the side of the road, the grandeur of the infinite sky, or the brilliant lights of the city shining like colorful jewels. Or maybe you look out and notice the way the shadows are dancing in the moonlight. Or perhaps the rhythmic spattering of raindrops on your windshield, whatever. And this is the incredibly luxurious sensory experience that is somehow filling you with impatience and irritation. And to put the icing on the cake, when you think about it, being in a lousy mood won't actually make the traffic go any faster, now will it? In fact, it'll probably make the experience seem to last a lot longer than it actually is. It's all pretty illogical and silly, isn't it? Sure, it's common enough, but what's really going on is that because we don't really know how to wait, we're neglecting all of the splendor the present moment is offering us just so that we can continue indulging in the pettiness of our self-importance. However, like I said, the main point has to do with liberating ourselves at the level of our subjective experience, and hence at the level of how we perceive the quality of our lives. The unpopular fact is that there's not a single thing about being in a traffic jam that somehow negates our ability to decide that we're going to live through that experience with a better attitude. Perhaps by allowing ourselves to perceive the intimations of beauty the present moment is almost always offering us. And I say unpopular fact because what that means is that we ourselves are ultimately responsible for the quality of the experiences we're having, or the lack thereof. Of course, at this point, it's always tempting to blame the traffic jam for our rotten emotional state. But the reality is that the traffic jam is just being what it is. A traffic jam, whether you like it or not. It's not going out of its way to force you into one mood or another. It's only providing an occasion for you to determine your own mood in response to it. Consequently, the reality of situations like traffic jams is that at any point we could suddenly decide that we're going to drop our lousy attitude, along with all of the silly self-importance that seems to justify it. In other words, we could decide that we're going to fill our lives with fulfilling, high-quality experiences rather than petty complaints and peevishness. That is, we could decide that we're going to be powerful, deeply free agents in this life, rather than continuing to act like its victims and slaves. Like the quote at the start of this video says, we either make ourselves miserable or we make ourselves strong. The amount of work is the same. But at this point, I feel like I have to tell you something. I have to tell you that I wish you wouldn't just believe what I'm saying. What I wish is that you would try it out for yourself and discover for yourself how free you can possibly be in this life. Sure, that's probably going to take some practice, most likely a lot of practice. That's because, contrary to popular opinion, freedom is actually an acquired taste. In other words, it takes a lot of experience with it. First, just to begin to enjoy it, and then ultimately to revel in it. If that's a bit counterintuitive, try thinking of it this way. Practically no one plays the violin well on their first try. And so it is with the process of laying claim to our existential freedom. It's not a matter of just having freedom, it's a matter of practicing freedom. A little like practicing a musical instrument every day until eventually you find, much to your own astonishment, that you've somehow become the brilliant virtuoso of your own life's music. No longer just blindly following the plodding herd. No longer worshiping inauthentically at the temple of other people's ridiculous tin gods, but seizing the reins of your own life and your own values and riding that wild, charging stallion with every bit of passion that's in your soul, riding that beautiful, powerful animal, its exquisite musculature gleaming with sweat as one year gives way to the next, and then the next, with the wind howling like a storm through your hair. You see, the thing is, you are free. Do you know that? And if you're not convinced, well, like I said, it might take a little bit of time. However, beyond all of the considerations having to do with our existential freedom, mastering the art of waiting is also valuable because it can help us live through some of life's most painful, most difficult moments. That's because it's pretty much inevitable that life will beat you up and lay you low at times. And it will probably happen to you in the worst possible way and when you least expect it. But don't worry, at least not too much. You're in good company because every life knows its own night of torment, and we all eventually spill our blood on the road we're traveling in one way or another. And sometimes life injures us so deeply that no amount of distraction or narcosis can salve our wounds. Of course, when that happens, it's a lot easier to live through it when we have some hope that things will eventually get better. But the fact is that sometimes hope is just hard to find. Sometimes people call that kind of experience a dark midnight of the soul, where all of our resources are expended and we're left bereft and hopeless. And so the question is, how do we make it through times like those? What sustains us when everything else has fallen away? Sometimes I think that we manage to survive times like those simply out of sheer stubbornness and defiance. That we keep fighting precisely because life is giving us every reason to give in and give up. Or maybe we survive because the inscrutable force of life keeps moving through us, like our breath. But one thing I've discovered through the years is that it's a lot easier to get through those kinds of times when we know how to wait. Because sometimes waiting is all we have. The capacity to keep enduring moment by moment, drifting in the trackless ocean of our suffering until maybe some fair wind eventually fills our sails. So then the question becomes, if dark midnights of the soul are pretty much inevitable in this life, and if knowing how to wait can help us get through them, then, well, how can we learn how to wait? Well, first I'd say that the process involves learning to honor and appreciate the experience of waiting instead of running away from it whenever we can. And learning how to wait also naturally involves practicing it and getting so intimately acquainted with it that it no longer repels or irritates us. For me personally, one of the best ways of doing that is by meditating, which my wife and I do typically a few hours per week. That's because in meditation, we learn how to empty ourselves and how to be comfortable with nothing other than the sensation of our breathing in and out, sometimes for hours at a time. And if you can be comfortable enough with yourself to be able to do that, well, then getting through a lot of life's difficult moments gets easier. Not exactly a piece of cake, but definitely easier. But, of course, meditation is not everyone's cup of tea. And as in all things, you need to find the path that works for you. But the important thing is to learn to find a way of waiting, because no matter who you are, life will demand it of you one way or another. And when life gets hard, and when you find yourself howling in your agony, bereft of all hope, when your very personal dark midnight of the soul is hard upon you, well, you may find that waiting is your only way out. And as you make your way a little further down life's road, your ability to wait, which is really just a way of being comfortable with yourself, may help you discover that you're actually far freer than you ever thought possible, even at the deepest levels of your being. And at that point, who knows? You may decide to make a life project out of reclaiming and celebrating your existential freedom, perhaps in the small moments of your life most of all. And along the way, you may even start to liberate your very soul and become a powerful source of liberation for the people around you too. And at the end of the day, maybe that's what you've really been waiting for all along. But hell, don't believe me. Try it out for yourself. Anyhow, as always, thanks for watching and take care of your soul.